I was standing near the kitchen island in my good cardigan, holding a glass of Prosecco I hadn't touched, when my daughter-in-law tapped a spoon against her own glass and asked the room to quiet down for a toast. The kitchen smelled faintly of the rosemary garnish someone had arranged across a cheese board, string lights glowing warm along the porch railing visible through the tall farmhouse windows, 30 guests settling into the particular anticipatory hush that comes right before a toast nobody has fully braced for yet. I remember thinking, glancing around at the exposed beams and the fresh coat of sage green paint, how strange it was that a house I had personally made possible could feel so unfamiliar to stand inside. I had no idea that within the next minute I would be mocked in front of 30 strangers filming for a design brand's social media following, and that within the following week I would make a single phone call to my attorney that would change the entire financial arrangement underneath that beautiful farmhouse permanently. My name is Margaret Doyle. Everyone calls me Meg. I'm 65 years old. I spent 32 years as an emergency room trauma nurse, the kind of job that teaches you to stay perfectly calm while everything around you is falling apart, because someone in the room has to be the person who doesn't panic. My husband Walt died 4 years ago. A sudden aneurysm at his own retirement party, of all places, surrounded by co-workers raising a toast to 40 years of steady, unremarkable service as a civil engineer. I still remember the exact moment his face changed, mid-laugh at something someone had said, before he simply wasn't there anymore. Grief that arrives in the middle of a celebration teaches you something particular. It teaches you that joy and loss can occupy the very same room, sometimes the very same minute, and that you have to learn to keep living inside both truths at once. Walt and I built our life together slowly, the unglamorous way most honest things get built. He worked as a civil engineer for the county for 38 years, steady and precise, the kind of man who double-checked every measurement twice before he trusted it, a habit that used to drive me a little crazy until I understood it was simply how he loved the people around him, carefully, without ever cutting corners. He inspected half the bridges in this county at some point in his career, and even decades later. Driving anywhere with him meant hearing a small, proud comment about a guardrail he'd specified or a drainage system he'd once argued for against considerable pushback. When I told him at 24 years old that I wanted to go into emergency nursing rather than something calmer and more predictable, he didn't tell me it was a hard path. He told me he'd learned to sleep through phone calls at 3 in the morning, and he meant it, and he never once complained about it in 36 years of marriage. I built my career slowly after that, the way most honest careers get built, one impossible overnight shift at a time, 32 years surviving trauma bays and grieving families until I finally retired with more steadiness than I sometimes believed I had any right to feel. I remember one young nurse in particular, a woman named Priscilla, who joined our floor straight out of nursing school, brilliant under pressure, but terrified of speaking up to attending physicians twice her age. I spent nearly a year quietly coaching her after difficult shifts, teaching her how to advocate for her patients without apologizing for taking up space, never once mentioning to the hospital administration how much of her eventual confidence I'd helped build behind the scenes. She became one of the best charge nurses that hospital ever had, and years later, a card arrived thanking me for teaching her that competence and humility didn't have to look the same. I think about that card often now, in a different light than I once did. I remember one young nurse in particular, a woman named Teresa, who started with us fresh out of nursing school, brilliant under pressure but terrified of speaking up to attending physicians twice her age. I spent an entire year quietly coaching her after difficult shifts, teaching her how to advocate firmly for her patients even when a doctor pushed back, never once mentioning to the hospital administration how much of her eventual charge nurse promotion I'd helped engineer behind the scenes. She runs an entire trauma unit of her own now, 3 states away, and still sends me a card every year on the anniversary of her first shift. I think about those cards differently now than I once did. I had been proud of my own invisible support for years, proud of asking for nothing in return. It took the events at the farmhouse to make me wonder whether that kind of invisibility, however well-intentioned, sometimes costs the mentor more than either party ever fully accounts for. Walt didn't live to see me fully retire. He died 2 years before I finally left the hospital floor, and some mornings I still catch myself wanting to tell him about a particularly difficult shift before remembering there's no one on the other end of that particular line anymore. I have 2 children. Kate, my daughter, is an emergency room physician herself, 3 time zones away, sharp and steady in exactly the way you'd hope a trauma doctor would be. She calls every Sunday night after her shift ends, no matter how late, a habit she started the year after her father died and never broke. Nathan, my son, is 35, a high school history teacher, married for 5 years to a woman named Brielle Foster, 33, who runs a home renovation and interior design content brand with a modest but devoted following, documenting what she calls the Willow House Project, the farmhouse she and Nathan bought and slowly renovated over the past year. Nathan and Brielle married 3 years after they met at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue, a small ceremony in my own backyard, under the same oak tree Walt had planted the year Nathan was born. I remember how genuinely happy Nathan seemed that day, how naturally Brielle fit into our small family gathering, asking real questions about Walt, about the man Nathan had become before she knew him. They spent their first 2 years of marriage in a cramped one-bedroom apartment while Nathan finished his teaching credential and Brielle built her modest following slowly, one honest post at a time, long before the farmhouse or the sponsorship deals entered the picture at all. Brielle grew up in a family that moved constantly, renting apartment after apartment, never staying anywhere long enough to paint a wall a color of her own choosing. I don't say that to excuse what eventually happened. I say it because understanding where someone's hunger for a beautiful permanent home comes from doesn't mean you're obligated to keep feeding that hunger forever, especially once feeding it starts costing you your own dignity. I understood that hunger better than most in a way, since Nathan had grown up with a version of the same instability, 3 different houses before he turned 10, thanks to Walt's engineering assignments moving us across 2 states. I remember Nathan at 7 years old crying in a moving truck about leaving behind a treehouse he'd only just finished building and promising himself, even at that age, that his own children would never have to feel that particular loss. Kate, older by 3 years, had adjusted more easily to each move and used to tease Nathan gently about how attached he got to houses that were never going to be permanent anyway. I think that shared wound, his and Brielle's, was part of what drew them together so quickly. I also think it made the farmhouse mean something to both of them that went far beyond ordinary homeownership, a stake driven into the ground against 2 different childhoods of impermanence. She told me a story once, early in her relationship with Nathan, back when we still spoke easily and often, about moving schools for the 4th time in 6 years, halfway through 8th grade, and having to leave behind a bedroom she'd finally finished decorating exactly the way she wanted. I remember packing up those string lights, she told me, and promising myself that someday I'd have a house nobody could ever make me leave, one that was entirely, completely mine. I remember thinking at the time that it was a sad story, worthy of real compassion. I didn't yet understand that she had built an entire adult identity around proving that permanence, once found, belonged to her and her alone, and that I would eventually become the inconvenient proof that some of it, quite literally, didn't. I saw the farmhouse myself for the first time about a week before Nathan called me about the financing, invited along on a walkthrough with the real estate agent, Nathan practically vibrating with excitement the entire visit. The place needed everything: water damage along the ceiling, outdated wiring, a kitchen that hadn't been touched since the 70s, but I understood immediately why Brielle had fallen in love with it. The original hardwood floors still intact beneath decades of grime, the wraparound porch overlooking 2 acres of overgrown but genuinely beautiful land. I remember Brielle standing in the empty living room, describing in vivid detail exactly how she'd bring the space back to life, gesturing at a water-stained wall as though she could already see the finished paint color, and thinking, watching her, that she had a real gift for seeing potential other people would have simply written off as too far gone. "What do you think, Meg?" she'd asked me that day, genuinely curious about my opinion, in a way she rarely asked afterward once the money entered the picture. I told her I thought it was beautiful, and I meant it completely. 2 years ago, Nathan called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying a particular strain I recognized from his childhood, the tone he used whenever he'd broken something and wasn't sure how to tell me. "Mom," he said, "we found the house. The farmhouse out on Miller Road, the one with the wraparound porch Brielle's been dreaming about for years. But the bank will only approve us for about 2/3 of what we need, and the sellers won't wait around while we figure out the rest." "Have you looked at anything else?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Something closer to what the bank will actually approve?" "We have," Nathan admitted. "Nothing else made Brielle light up the way that farmhouse did. I know that probably sounds like a strange reason to make such a big decision, but I want to give her the home she's been dreaming about since she was a kid, moving from place to place and never getting to keep any of it." I sat with that phone pressed to my ear for a long moment, listening to the particular urgency in my son's voice. The same urgency I remembered from him as a boy trying to convince me of something he'd already decided mattered enormously. I thought about Walt, about the modest but steady life we'd built together, about the savings I'd carefully protected through his sudden death and afterward, enough to live comfortably for the rest of my days if I was sensible about it. I thought, too, about how much I wanted to see Nathan settled somewhere permanent, somewhere his own children could grow up the way he never quite had, since Walt's engineering job had moved our own family 3 times before Nathan turned 10. "How much do you need?" I asked him. "I 150,000, he said. "I know that's an enormous ask, Mom. We'd pay you back, obviously, with real terms, not just a handshake. I don't want this to be complicated for either of us." Before calling him back, I met with my attorney, a careful, thorough woman named Josephine Reyes, who had handled Walt's estate after he died and understood our family's finances better than almost anyone outside of it. I explained the situation and asked her plainly how to structure something this large responsibly. "A private loan needs real terms to hold up, both legally and with the IRS," she told me, pulling out a legal pad and beginning to sketch out the basic framework as she spoke. "An interest rate at or above the applicable federal rate, a recorded lien, and ideally a due-on-demand clause, standard protection for the lender. It protects you, and honestly, it protects Nathan too, since it establishes a legitimate paper trail rather than an ambiguous gift that could complicate things later." I thanked her and left her office confident I understood exactly what I was about to do. I thought about it for exactly one night before calling him back. "I can loan you the money," I told him, "but we need to do this properly. A real promissory note recorded against the property with an actual interest rate the IRS will recognize as legitimate rather than a disguised gift. I'll set the rate well below what a bank would charge you, but it needs to be real paper, Nathan, not just family goodwill. That protects both of us." Nathan agreed immediately, relieved, and within 3 weeks my attorney had drawn up a proper promissory note, $150,000 at 2% interest, secured by a second lien recorded against the property itself, with a standard due-on-demand clause allowing me to call the full balance due at any time with 90 days' notice, the same clause any competent attorney includes in a private family loan to keep the arrangement legally sound. We signed the paperwork together in Josephine's small conference office, Nathan reading every page carefully, Brielle signing quickly and gratefully, thanking me twice in the parking lot afterward with real tears in her eyes. Tears I remembered clearly 2 years later, standing in that same farmhouse listening to a joke about my flannel shirt. I want to be honest about something. That legal structure was necessary and correct, and it was also, I understand now, a way of making the arrangement feel more like smart planning than pure generosity, for everyone's comfort, myself included. What started as a straightforward loan slowly became something considerably larger in practice, the way these arrangements sometimes do. 8 months into the renovation, the original contractor's estimate ran nearly $40,000 over budget once they discovered structural rot in the original farmhouse foundation, the kind of discovery that either sinks a renovation entirely or forces a family to find money nobody had planned on spending. I remember Nathan calling me that evening, his voice tight with a fear I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager, describing a car accident he'd been in, certain the whole project was about to collapse. Mom, the contractor says if we don't fix this now, the whole structure could be compromised within a few years, he said. I don't know where we find $40,000 we don't have. I told him to breathe, that we'd figure it out together, and covered the overage directly, transferring the funds straight to the contractor rather than routing it through Nathan and Brielle's account, an informal addition to the note that my attorney and I simply amended into the paperwork the following week. A year in, when Brielle wanted a specific reclaimed wood for the kitchen island that cost considerably more than the renovation budget allowed, salvaged from a decommissioned barn 2 counties over that she'd fallen in love with during a weekend scouting trip, I quietly covered the $11,000 difference myself, calling it at the time an early housewarming gift. By the time the 1-year anniversary of their move-in arrived, I had contributed nearly $210,000 total toward a home that, to nearly everyone who saw it online, appeared to be the product of Brielle's design vision and Nathan's hard work alone. I want to be clear about something. I never once regretted a single dollar. I loved watching Nathan finally settle into a home of his own, something he'd wanted his whole life. I loved seeing Brielle's genuine talent for design unfold room by room, the way she could look at a water-damaged farmhouse and see exactly what it could become. What I minded, what slowly began working on something inside me, the way water works on stone, was what came after the money. The small, deniable ways my presence in the story of that house began to shrink even as my financial involvement grew. The first time I noticed it clearly was about 4 months into the renovation, when Brielle posted a video to her design following describing how she and Nathan had scraped together every available resource to make the farmhouse dream possible. The video was well produced, warm lighting, an upbeat soundtrack, Brielle speaking directly to camera in the half-finished kitchen with genuine excitement in her voice. She mentioned a generous contractor discount, a lucky material find at a salvage yard, her own careful budgeting spreadsheet, thanking her followers for cheering the project on from the very beginning. She did not mention the $150,000 loan or the foundation overage or any part of what I had contributed. I watched that video twice, sitting alone in my kitchen, looking for even a passing mention of family support, and found none, rereading the caption underneath to make certain I hadn't simply missed something in the scroll. The comments underneath were full of admiration, several followers asking, in earnest, how they might manage something similar on their own modest budgets. Entirely unaware they were asking Brielle to explain a financial reality that wasn't actually hers to explain. The second incident came at a small dinner Brielle hosted for 2 of her design brand's sponsor representatives, considering a partnership deal built around the farmhouse renovation story, held in the newly finished dining room with candles down the center of the reclaimed wood table. I attended at Nathan's invitation, sitting quietly near the end of the table while Brielle described, in polished, rehearsed detail, how she and Nathan had financed the entire project through disciplined saving and one very understanding bank. One of the sponsors, impressed, asked whether family had helped at all with such an ambitious project. Brielle answered smoothly, "Oh, everyone's been supportive in their own way, but this was really something we built ourselves, brick by brick." I said nothing. I smiled through the rest of dinner and told myself one more time that she simply hadn't thought carefully about how the comments sounded. I mentioned that dinner to Kate during our regular Sunday call that same week, trying to keep my tone light. "It's strange," I told her, "watching $190,000 of my own money get described as disciplined saving in one very understanding bank." Kate was quiet for a moment. "Mom, that's not strange. That's a problem," she said. "You should say something before this becomes the permanent version of the story." I told her I would eventually, once the timing felt right. I didn't yet understand how many more times I would tell myself that exact same thing over the following year and a half. The third incident happened at Nathan's 35th birthday dinner, held at the farmhouse with a handful of close friends and family gathered around the newly finished dining table, Kate having flown in specially for the occasion since she rarely got to see her brother in person. Brielle gave a toast thanking their contractor, their realtor, and a local salvage yard owner by name for making the renovation possible. Her gratitude warm and specific for each of them. She gestured vaguely toward me at one point, adding, and of course Nathan's mom, who's always been so encouraging, before moving directly on to describe a specific tile pattern she was proud of in the downstairs bathroom. Encouraging. 2 years in, and already $200,000 deep, reduced to a single vague adjective that could have applied to anyone who'd sent a nice card. I caught Kate's eye across the table, and something in her expression told me she'd noticed it too. I smiled and said nothing, because that's what you do, and I told myself again that she simply hadn't thought about her wording carefully. I didn't understand yet that splinters left alone don't disappear. They work their way deeper. The fourth incident happened during a local news segment about the renovation, filmed at the farmhouse itself, part of a series on young homeowners transforming historic properties. I remember Nathan calling me excitedly the week the segment was scheduled to film, asking if I wanted to stop by and watch, though I ultimately decided to stay home and watch the broadcast instead, not wanting to complicate the filming with my own presence. The reporter asked on camera how Brielle and Nathan had managed such an ambitious renovation on a teacher's salary and a modest design income. Brielle answered smoothly, without hesitation, describing months of careful saving and a small home equity arrangement, gesturing vaguely at the property itself rather than mentioning me by name at all. I watched the segment air 2 weeks later, sitting alone in my living room, hearing myself reduced to a small home equity arrangement rather than a person. My name never once mentioned in 3 minutes of coverage about a house I had personally made possible. Rewinding the recording once to make certain I hadn't simply misheard the framing. The fifth incident happened at a design industry meetup Brielle hosted at the farmhouse itself, gathering a dozen or so fellow content creators and 2 brand representatives to tour the finished renovation. String lights strung along the porch railing for the occasion, and a charcuterie spread arranged specifically for the group's photographs. I attended at Nathan's invitation, standing quietly near the kitchen while Brielle walked her guests through each room, describing the vision behind every choice in vivid, confident detail, gesturing at the reclaimed wood island I had personally helped fund, without a word about where the wood or the money had actually come from. When one of the other creators, a woman with an even larger following than Brielle's own, asked how they'd secured financing for such an ambitious project, Brielle laughed and said, "Family helped a little, but honestly, most of this came down to negotiating hard and knowing where to cut corners smartly." The other creator nodded approvingly, clearly taking mental notes for her own future projects. I stood there in my flannel shirt, holding a glass of wine, listening to $210,000 of my own careful savings described as knowing where to cut corners. The sixth incident happened at a seating arrangement conversation for an upcoming magazine features photo shoot, when Brielle mentioned, almost as an aside, that she wanted the family and friends section of the shoot to feature people who really represented the project's spirit, a list that included the contractor, the salvage yard owner, and 2 of her fellow content creators, but not me. Nathan mentioned it to me afterward, a little uncomfortably, standing in my kitchen with his hands jammed in his pockets the way he used to as a boy delivering bad news. "I told her that seemed strange," he said, "but she said it was really just about the visual composition of the shoot, not about anyone's actual importance." I told him it was fine, that I understood photo shoots had limited space. I told myself that even as I said it, unconvinced by my own reassurance. The magazine feature published 2 months later, a glossy 6-page spread with beautiful photography of every finished room, Brielle and Nathan smiling on the wraparound porch, the contractor and salvage yard owner featured prominently in a sidebar about the project's key collaborators. The photographer had spent an entire day at the farmhouse for the shoot, Nathan told me afterward, carefully staging every room to look exactly as polished as the finished product deserved, never once asking who else might have been involved in making that polish possible. I was not mentioned anywhere in 6 pages of coverage about a house I had personally made financially possible. I bought a copy at the grocery store checkout line, of all places, recognizing the cover before I'd even registered what I was looking at, and read the entire piece standing in my car in the parking lot, searching one more time for even a passing acknowledgement of what I had contributed. I called Kate that same evening, trying to keep my voice light. 6 pages, I told her, and I'm not in a single one of them, not even as a footnote. Kate was quiet for a moment. "Mom, that's not just an oversight anymore," she said. "That's a pattern, and patterns don't fix themselves. You need to say something before this becomes the permanent version of the story that gets printed and reprinted forever." I told her I would, eventually, once the timing felt right. I didn't yet understand how many more months I would tell myself that exact same thing. The 7th incident is the one I think about most because it's the one where I should have said something and didn't. It happened at a smaller family dinner, just the 4 of us, Nathan, Brielle, myself, and Brielle's own mother visiting from out of town, the good china out for the occasion, and a roast Brielle had spent all afternoon preparing. Brielle's mother, a warm but somewhat oblivious woman named Diane, mentioned, raising her own glass partway through the meal, how proud she was watching her daughter and son-in-law build something so impressive entirely through their own determination, without a single mention of anyone else's help. "I don't know how you two managed it," she said, shaking her head admiringly. "Young people today have it so much harder buying a home, and you did it entirely on your own." I said nothing to correct her, the same way I'd said nothing to correct anyone else. Though I remember driving home afterward, feeling the particular loneliness of being the only person in an entire extended family who actually knew the truth of a story everyone else believed completely. I want to tell you that I confronted this early, that I was the kind of woman who draws a firm line the moment she's disrespected. I wasn't. I told myself 100 different stories to avoid dealing with the truth. She's building a brand, and brands need clean narratives. She's young and still learning how to talk about money publicly. Nathan loves me, even if he doesn't correct her in the moment. I believed every one of those stories, some days more than others, because believing them was easier than accepting that the home I had quietly financed from the very beginning had become a place where my own contribution was treated as an inconvenient footnote rather than the foundation it actually was. There was an evening, roughly a year into the renovation, when Nathan himself brought it up unprompted, sitting at my kitchen table over coffee. "Mom, I noticed Brielle's last video didn't mention the loan again," he said, a little uncomfortably. "Do you want me to say something to her about it?" I remember telling him it was fine, that I didn't need public credit for helping my own son, and watching relief cross his face at not having to have a harder conversation with his wife. I believed what I told him in that moment. It would take another year and one very public toast before I understood how much that particular kindness to Nathan had actually cost me. There was one evening, about a month before the 1-year housewarming, when I came close to saying something. Brielle called to ask whether I could cover an unexpected $6,000 landscaping expense before a magazine photographer was scheduled to visit for a feature. "I hate even asking," she said in a tone that sounded genuinely apologetic, "but the photographer's coming Thursday and the front bed still looked terrible from all the construction traffic." I sat with the phone in my hand afterward, feeling something rise up in me that felt very close to the surface, very close to finally saying out loud everything I'd swallowed for 2 years. Then I thought about Nathan's happiness, about how much the house had already come to mean to him, about how a fight over credit would only ever complicate something he loved. I covered the landscaping expense and told myself one more time that the moment to say something hadn't quite arrived yet. Looking back, I understand now that I was wrong about that. The moment had arrived long before. I simply hadn't been ready to stand inside it yet. The week of the housewarming itself, I sat one evening at my kitchen table with a photograph of Walt I kept on the windowsill, the two of us standing in front of the very first house we ever bought together, young and slightly nervous, decades before either of us had any idea what the rest of our lives would look like. I remember thinking, looking at that photograph, that Walt and I had built our entire marriage on the assumption that both of us mattered equally in every room we entered together. that no amount of success ever excused treating the other person as background scenery in their own life, I wondered, sitting there, what Walt would have made of the version of myself I'd become over the previous 2 years, quietly funding a family's dream home while accepting again and again a smaller and smaller share of its acknowledgement. I didn't like the answer that came to me. I suspected he wouldn't have liked it either. Then came the 1-year housewarming. The farmhouse had been transformed for the occasion, string lights along the wraparound porch, the newly finished kitchen gleaming under carefully arranged lighting for the cameras, 30 guests including several of Brielle's fellow design creators, 2 brand representatives considering a larger sponsorship deal, and a photographer documenting the entire evening for an upcoming magazine feature. This wasn't a simple family gathering, it was a full content event, the kind Brielle had been planning for weeks, complete with a curated playlist and a table of styled appetizers arranged for maximum photographic appeal. I parked my modest sedan among a row of far newer cars in the gravel driveway, noting, not for the first time, how different this world was from the small, unremarkable ranch house Walt and I had shared for over 30 years, comfortable but never once designed with a camera in mind. I arrived in my good cardigan over a flannel shirt, having spent the earlier part of the afternoon helping Nathan set up folding chairs on the lawn, out of habit as much as love. Nathan found me near the kitchen island and hugged me tightly. "Thanks for everything, Mom," he said, and for a moment, standing there with my son's arms around me, I let myself believe the evening would unfold exactly as it should have. Brielle greeted guests near the porch entrance with practiced warmth, complimenting a fellow creator's recent post, thanking a brand representative for making the drive. She acknowledged me briefly near the kitchen, a quick "So glad you could make it, Meg," before moving on to the next cluster of arriving guests, the same vague warmth she extended to everyone in the room, indistinguishable from how she greeted the photographer she'd hired only that week. For the first hour, the evening was in fact lovely. I spoke with 2 of Brielle's fellow creators, both genuinely curious about the farmhouse's original condition before the renovation began, one of them mentioning she'd been following the project since the very first demolition video and could hardly believe the transformation. I also spoke with one of the brand representatives, a quiet, observant woman named Denise, who asked, almost as an aside, how the financing for such an ambitious project had actually come together. I answered honestly, mentioning the private loan in plain, factual terms, and watched Brielle's attention flicker toward us from across the room without quite approaching. I watched Nathan move through the crowd, glowing with the pride of a man watching his dream home finally recognized publicly. For a little while, I let myself believe the whole evening might simply pass without incident. The toasts began around 7, after the past appetizers had made their rounds. Nathan went first, thanking Brielle for her vision, thanking the contractors, describing with genuine emotion the moment they had first walked through the farmhouse's water-damaged rooms and seen what it could become. He didn't mention me at all, though I told myself that was simply an oversight, the way I had told myself so many things over the previous 2 years. Then Brielle stepped forward, tapped her glass, and smiled the particular bright, camera-ready smile I'd come to recognize over the previous 2 years, as the one she used right before saying something designed to land as charming to everyone except its actual target. "I want to say a few words about the people who really understand this house," she began, her eyes moving warmly across the room, lingering on the brand representatives, the fellow creators, the photographer capturing every moment. "This farmhouse represents 2 years of vision, hustle, and knowing exactly what we wanted, even when it seemed impossible." A ripple of appreciative applause moved through the room. Then her eyes found me, standing near the kitchen island in my cardigan and flannel, and something in her expression sharpened almost imperceptibly. "And I do want to raise a glass," she continued, her voice never losing its warm, celebratory lilt, "to the family members who show up in flannel and think that's a design statement, but never quite offered a single design opinion we actually ended up using." A small laugh rippled through part of the room. "To the woman who thinks flannel is a design statement," Brielle continued, raising her glass higher, "but never actually contributed anything we could put on the mood board." The room laughed, uncertain at first, then more freely as people decided the comment was simply affectionate teasing rather than anything sharper. One of the fellow creators near the front called out, "Brielle, you're terrible," in the exact tone people use when they don't actually think anyone is being unkind at all. I noticed from the corner of my eye that the quiet brand representative I'd spoken with earlier wasn't laughing at all, her expression carrying the particular discomfort of someone doing quick mental math about a story she'd been considering funding. I looked at Nathan. He was staring at his glass, his jaw tight, his shoulders drawn in. He said nothing. He did nothing. In 5 years of marriage to Brielle, I had watched my son learn to go very still whenever his wife needed an audience more than she needed him to correct the record. I stood up slowly from where I'd been leaning against the kitchen island. The room quieted the way a room quiets when it senses something is about to happen that it hasn't fully decided how to feel about yet. I lifted my own glass, still full. In that brief span of seconds, standing there with every eye in the room suddenly fixed on me, I thought, oddly, of every difficult family member I had ever calmly, steadily managed over 32 years in the emergency room. This was simply one more difficult moment that needed handling, I told myself, and I was, if nothing else, extremely good at staying calm under exactly this kind of pressure. "Since we're toasting the people who really understand this house," I said, and my voice came out calmer than I expected it to, calmer than I felt, "I'd like to raise one too, to the house," I continued, "whose loan just came due." The silence that followed was the kind you could have poured into a glass and served alongside the Prosecco. Brielle's smile didn't fall so much as it simply stopped existing, replaced by something rigid and confused. Nathan looked at me the way you look at a stranger who has just spoken a language you don't recognize. "Mom," he said quietly, "what does that mean?" I didn't answer him. Not there. Not in front of 30 guests who had just laughed at a joke about my flannel shirt, in a house built on a foundation I'd personally financed, on renovation costs I'd quietly covered more than once. I set my glass down gently on the nearest table, walked to Nathan first, kissed his cheek, told him I loved him and that nothing about tonight changed that, and then I picked up my purse and walked toward the front door, past the string lights, past the photographer who lowered his camera slightly as I passed, past 30 faces that had gone very quiet, very fast. I drove home with the windows down, the cool autumn air moving through the car, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not rage, something quieter and colder than that. Clarity. Somewhere along that dark country road, I thought about the first year after Walt died. The long, disorienting months of learning how to manage every decision alone after 36 years of sharing them with someone else. Walt had always handled the car maintenance, the insurance renewals, the small mechanical repairs around the house, while I managed our finances and eventually the impossible logistics of his sudden death. I remembered sitting at our kitchen table in the weeks after his funeral, staring at a stack of paperwork I'd never had to think through alone before, and the strange, hard-won pride that came afterward when I realized I could handle every piece of it myself. Widowhood teaches you, whether you want the lesson or not, that you are considerably more capable than you ever gave yourself credit for while someone else was standing beside you. I think some part of me had simply forgotten that lesson over the previous 2 years, quietly handing my own dignity over to a new family arrangement that had stopped noticing it was a gift rather than a given. Driving home from that housewarming, I felt that old, hard-won capability rising back up in me, the same steadiness that had carried me through those first impossible months alone, and I understood with total clarity exactly what I was going to do before I even reached my own driveway. Nathan told me weeks later what happened at the party after I'd gone, pieced together from what he remembered and what Brielle eventually admitted to. Apparently the gathering had gone quiet for several minutes, guests exchanging uncertain glances, before Nathan had finally turned to Brielle, in front of whoever was still close enough to hear, and asked her in a voice he described as flatter than he'd ever used with her before, what exactly she thought she'd just done. Brielle had tried to laugh it off, calling it a joke that had simply landed wrong, and Nathan, for the first time in 5 years of marriage, hadn't laughed along or gone quiet. He'd simply said, "She financed this entire house, Brielle. I don't think you understand what you just put at risk." Denise, standing near the drinks table, had quietly excused herself and left within 10 minutes of that exchange, a detail Nathan mentioned almost as an afterthought, but one that stayed with me longer than almost anything else he described. Then he'd walked toward the driveway himself, though by the time he got there, my car was already gone. Kate called me the next morning, having heard the whole story from Nathan the night before, his voice apparently shaking as he recounted it to her over the phone. "Mom," she said, "tell me exactly what happened." I told her everything: the toast, the laughter, the walk to my car alone under the porch lights I'd helped pay to install. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "Mom, you've been letting yourself get smaller for 2 years so Brielle can feel bigger about a house you actually made possible. That's not generosity anymore. That's just a slow kind of disappearing." "I know," I said, closing my eyes for a moment against the weight of finally saying it out loud. "I think I've known it for a while." "Why didn't you say anything sooner? Any of the earlier times?" Because every time I considered it, I thought about how happy Nathan finally seemed, settled somewhere permanent for the first time in his adult life. A fight over credit always felt like it would only complicate something he loved. "Mom, that's the exact reasoning I hear from patients who've been absorbing something painful for years," Kate said. "There's always a reason it's not quite the right moment. Sometimes you have to decide the moment has arrived, even when it's inconvenient for everyone else's story." "Are you going to actually call the note, or was that just something to say in the moment?" I sat with that question for a long moment, looking out at my own quiet backyard, thinking about Walt, about how he would have handled this, about the particular clarity that settles over you after you've finally stopped absorbing something you should have addressed a long time ago. "I already know exactly what I'm going to do," I told her. "I just needed a night to be certain." I still remember what happened next. That evening, I sat at my own kitchen table with a cup of tea and the promissory note I'd signed with Nathan 2 years earlier, reviewing it carefully the way 32 years of trauma nursing had trained me to review anything that mattered methodically, without flinching. The note included a standard due-on-demand clause with 90 days' notice, the same clause my attorney had insisted on from the very beginning, a basic protection rather than anything unusual or punitive. 2% interest, far below what any bank would have charged, had been my choice from the start. A genuine kindness disguised for everyone's comfort as smart family financial planning. Part of me wanted to call Nathan first, to give him the chance to fix this himself, to stand up for me the way I had waited 2 years for him to stand up for me. But some quiet, clinical part of my mind reminded me that I had given him that chance repeatedly already, at every one of those earlier incidents, and he had failed to take it every single time. Warnings only work on people who are listening for them, and Nathan had trained himself carefully and probably without meaning to, not to hear anything that might require him to disagree with his wife's version of their story. I thought about Walt, about how he would have handled this, and I found myself smiling faintly in the quiet kitchen. Walt would have said very little, I decided. He would have simply double-checked the numbers, quietly and completely, the same way he double-checked everything, and let the correction speak for itself. I thought that was exactly the kind of response this particular moment called for. I thought, too, about the phrase Brielle had used in front of 30 people. Never contributed anything we could put on the mood board. As though 32 years of trauma nursing, $210,000 in quiet financial support, and a recorded lien on the property amounted to nothing more than a woman standing in the wrong outfit. I had spent 2 years trying to earn a kind of acknowledgement that should never have required earning in the first place. That, more than any single joke at that party, was the thing I finally understood sitting at my kitchen table that night. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do because I think it matters. I did not demand the money overnight. I did not threaten to take the house. I called my attorney the following morning, the same woman who had drafted the original note, and explained what had happened. "Margaret, is this decision made clearly, or is it made in anger?" Josephine asked, the same question she always asked before drafting anything significant. I told her the truth, that it had started in anger the night before, but that a full day of reflection had left me certain it was also simply the correct and overdue business decision. Then it's not really about anger anymore, she said. It's about finally exercising a right you always had. She confirmed the due-on-demand clause was still fully enforceable and helped me draft a formal professional notice, the same kind any private lender sends when calling a note due, informing Nathan and Brielle that the full remaining balance, just under $190,000 after 2 years of payments, would need to be satisfied within the standard 90-day window through refinancing or another financing arrangement of their choosing. She read the final language back to me over the phone before sending it, plain and unremarkable, the kind of letter that could have applied to any borrower anywhere in the state, which was, I understood even as she read it, precisely the point. I sent it that Monday morning through my attorney's office, formally, the way any professional lender would, with no personal note attached, no explanation beyond what the notice itself required. Nathan told me later, once enough time had passed, that he could describe it without his voice tightening, exactly what that Monday afternoon had looked like from his side. The certified letter had arrived at the farmhouse around noon, and he'd signed for it himself, assuming it was something related to the property tax reassessment they'd been expecting. He'd read it standing in the front hallway, still in his teaching clothes from that morning, certain at first that it must be some kind of error, a form letter meant for a different borrower entirely. It wasn't until he recognized my attorney's letterhead, the same one from the original closing 2 years earlier, that the full weight of it landed. He told me he'd had to sit down on the front porch steps for several minutes before he could bring himself to call me, needing the time simply to steady himself before hearing my voice. Nathan called that same afternoon, his voice tight with confusion. "Mom, did you send this? Did you send the whole balance due in 90 days? Is this some kind of message?" "It's not a message," I said calmly. "It's a standard exercise of a clause that's been in our notes since the very beginning, Nathan. I've been charging you 2% interest for 2 years. That arrangement was a kindness, not an obligation, and it was never meant to be permanent without acknowledgement." "Why now? Why the morning after the housewarming?" "Because last night, in front of 30 guests, your wife made a joke about my flannel shirt and how I never contributed anything worth putting on a mood board. I have contributed over $200,000 to that house, Nathan, and not one person in that room, including you, knew that. I think it's time the actual numbers became part of the story." There was a long silence on the line. "Mom, we can't refinance that fast without serious complications. Our rates would be so much higher than what you've been charging us." "I understand that," I said. "That's exactly why I gave you 90 days instead of 30. Nobody in this conversation is losing money except me, and I've already accepted that I gave more than I should have for longer than I should have without saying so." "What about the sponsorship deal? This could scare them off entirely if it gets out." "That's a real risk," I acknowledged. "It's also not new information you're only now discovering. It's simply the actual financial structure of this house becoming visible instead of hidden. Sponsors deserve accurate numbers, Nathan. If the honest version of this story can't survive being seen clearly, that's worth knowing sooner rather than later." I heard Brielle's voice in the background, sharp, asking who he was talking to, and then the sound of the phone changing hands. "Meg!" Brielle's voice, clipped and cold. "This is completely disproportionate. You're threatening our entire home over a joke that got a little out of hand." "No," I said quietly. "I'm the woman who financed this house for 2 years without asking for a single acknowledgement, and who was mocked for it publicly in front of your entire professional network by the person who benefited most. I think the real question is what you thought would happen once I finally understood exactly how you'd been telling this story. You're being vindictive." "I'm being accurate," I said. "There's a difference. I spent 32 years reading rooms under pressure. I know exactly how to recognize when something's gone wrong, and last night I finally recognized mine." "So this is really about teaching me a lesson." "It's about no longer subsidizing one," I said. "There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel that way to you tonight." She hung up on me. I sat with the dial tone for a long moment, then finished my tea and went about the rest of my evening. I saw my friend Rosalind for coffee the next morning, the way we did most weeks at the same corner diner we'd been meeting at since before either of us retired, and she listened to the entire story without interrupting, her cup going cold in front of her. Rosalind and I had worked the same emergency room floor for over a decade before she retired 2 years ahead of me, and she'd watched from a distance most of the farmhouse saga unfold over the previous 2 years, always with the particular patience of someone who has learned not to offer an opinion until it's actually asked for. "Margaret," she finally said, "I've watched you fund that house for 2 years and listened to you make excuses for it every single time I asked why you never mentioned it to anyone outside the family. I'm not going to pretend I'm surprised it finally caught up with everyone at once. I'm only sorry it took a room full of strangers laughing at your flannel shirt to get here." "I know," I said. "I keep waiting to feel guilty about it, and it isn't coming." "Maybe it isn't coming," Rosalind said, "because there's nothing here to feel guilty about. You didn't abandon anyone. You stopped subsidizing your own disrespect. Those aren't the same thing, no matter how Brielle wants to frame it." I turned my coffee cup slowly in my hands. "Nathan keeps asking if I'll extend the deadline." "And what are you going to tell him?" "That I already have an answer, and it isn't the one he's hoping for." Rosalind smiled, the particular smile of an old friend who has been waiting years to see you finally choose yourself. "Good," she said simply. "It's about time somebody in that family learned what things actually cost." The following weeks brought a different kind of pressure entirely. Nathan called nearly every day at first, his voice moving between panic and quiet reflection depending on the day. "Mom, I've been going through the numbers with an actual loan officer this time," he told me about 10 days after the notice went out. "Even at a higher rate, we can make it work if we adjust a few things. I just wish I'd understood this whole time exactly what you were actually covering for us." Kate offered, without my asking, to sit down with Nathan and walk through the actual financial picture using her own understanding of family finances, the same patient way she walked her own patients through difficult diagnoses, breaking down complicated information into pieces a frightened person could actually absorb. She drove down for an entire Saturday afternoon specifically for this purpose, spreading 2 years of financial statements across Nathan's own kitchen table, walking him through each line item with the same patient precision she brought to her professional work. Nathan told me a few weeks later that seeing the full $210,000 figure laid out plainly, rather than absorbed quietly into years of vague gratitude, had been humbling in ways he hadn't expected. "I knew it was significant," he said. "I don't think I understood it was nearly that significant until I saw the actual number in writing." Nathan told me several weeks after the housewarming about a conversation he'd had with a colleague at the high school, a fellow teacher named Marcus, who'd asked casually in the teacher's lounge between class periods how the party had gone. "I actually told him the truth for once," Nathan said, "instead of the polished version. I told him my wife had made a joke at my mother's expense in front of 30 people, and that my mother had responded by calling in the loan that made the whole house possible." Marcus had simply looked at him and said, "Sounds like your mom's been quietly running your family's finances for 2 years and nobody bothered to notice until she stopped, which isn't really a compliment in case you were wondering." Nathan told me hearing that from a colleague with no stake in either side of the situation had landed harder than almost anything else said that month. Brielle's design following noticed the shift almost immediately, even before the sponsorship deal officially fell through. Comments began appearing under her posts, asking politely at first whether the housewarming toast everyone had seen clips of online had actually been about her own mother-in-law, since someone had recognized me from an earlier video and pieced the story together. Brielle told me later that she'd spent an entire week agonizing over how to respond, finally deciding, on the advice of exactly no one, to simply post an honest video acknowledging the whole situation rather than trying to manage the narrative any further, sitting in her car in the driveway, no makeup, no ring light, just speaking plainly into her phone camera for 11 unedited minutes. That video, unpolished and visibly nervous, ended up performing better with her audience than almost anything she'd posted in the 2 years prior, a fact she found almost impossible to process at the time. Denise, the brand representative who'd asked me so plainly about the financing at the party, reached out to me directly a few weeks later, having found my number through Nathan. I wanted to say, I hope it's all right. That conversation we had about the loan structure stuck with me, she said. I could tell something was off well before the toast happened. I just didn't expect it to be quite that public. I told her I appreciated her noticing, both then and afterward. For what it's worth, Denise added, the brand still might work with them eventually once the story settles into something consistent. We just need to know we're building a partnership on solid ground, not a narrative that could shift again. I thanked her for her candor and told her I hoped, for Nathan and Brielle's sake, that the partnership would eventually work out on exactly those honest terms. One of Brielle's fellow creators, a woman named Priya, who'd attended the housewarming and had been one of the ones to laugh loudest at the toast, reached out to her privately afterward. Brielle showed me the message later, once things between us had softened enough for her to share it. I've been thinking about that toast since the party, Priya had written. I laughed because everyone else did, and I regret it. I don't think I understood until your video how much that joke actually cost someone. I hope you're doing okay, and I hope she is too. Brielle told me reading that message had been harder, in some ways, than losing the sponsorship deal itself, because it came from someone with no stake in either side of the story. She and Priya talked on the phone for over an hour after that message, Brielle told me. The first genuinely honest conversation the two of them had ever had, despite 2 years of friendly professional overlap. About a week after the notice went out, Nathan asked if I'd be willing to join a video call with him and Brielle together, something he described a little awkwardly as trying to get everyone on the same page. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity about what that page might actually contain, setting my laptop up at my own kitchen table, the same table where I'd first reviewed the promissory note 2 years earlier. When the call connected, Nathan was sitting at the farmhouse kitchen island, Brielle standing behind him, arms crossed, her expression carefully arranged into something between contrition and defensiveness. Mom, Nathan began, we wanted to talk through everything as a family, get on the same page about what happens next. I'm listening, I said, setting down my tea and giving the call my full attention. Brielle spoke first, her voice tighter than I'd heard it in years. I think we all said things in the heat of the moment. I know the joke landed wrong, but calling the note due this quickly, with no warning beyond what the paperwork technically requires, felt designed to hurt us as much as possible. Was that the intention? I considered the question honestly before answering. The intention was to stop subsidizing a story I was being erased from, I said. If it hurt, I understand that. It should. 2 years of quiet contributions don't disappear painlessly just because the reason they're ending is a good one. We could lose momentum on the brand entirely if this gets out to the wrong people, Brielle said, her composure cracking slightly. Is that really what you wanted? What I wanted, I said, was to stop being described as someone who never contributed anything worth putting on a mood board while paying for the very board it would have gone on. I never once asked either of you to build a home you couldn't afford. I only asked eventually, silently, and apparently not clearly enough, to be treated as an honest part of the story instead of a convenient omission. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, and then he turned slightly toward Brielle, away from the camera, in a way that suggested he'd forgotten, briefly, that I could still see them both. She's right, he said to her, quietly but clearly enough for me to hear. We built something we couldn't actually afford to tell honestly, and we let my mother carry the actual cost so we wouldn't have to admit that to each other, or to anyone else. Brielle's eyes filled, and for the first time in the entire call, she didn't have a rebuttal ready. I don't know how to fix a story that was built partly on someone else's silence, she said, almost to herself. That's not really my problem to solve, I told her gently, but I'll say this. A home built on somebody else's erased sacrifice was never actually standing on its own foundation to begin with. If the story collapses now, it's not because I called a note Jew. It's because it was never really telling the truth in the first place. Nobody spoke for a long moment after that. Nathan finally looked back at the camera. I don't know what happens next for the brand, he admitted, but I know what needs to happen with you and me, Mom. I need to actually correct the record out loud the next time someone erases you from something you built. I'd like that, I said. I've been waiting 2 years to hear it. Brielle spoke up once more before we ended the call, her voice steadier now. For what it's worth, Meg, I don't actually want the old rate back without earning it. I want to earn it by telling the truth for long enough that it stops feeling like a risk to tell it. I told her that was in fact exactly the arrangement I'd been hoping for, though I hadn't quite known how to phrase it myself until she said it first. The call ended a few minutes later, quieter than it began. Nathan came by my house alone one evening in the second week after the party, without calling first, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager, needing to talk through something he wasn't ready to say at the dinner table. He looked exhausted, standing on my porch like a man who'd rehearsed what he wanted to say the entire drive over and lost his nerve somewhere around my front steps. "Can I sit for a minute?" he asked. We sat on the porch swing his father had hung for me the summer before he died, and for a long moment Nathan said nothing at all, just stared out at the yard the way he used to when he was 15 and had done something he wasn't sure how to confess. "I keep thinking about that toast," he finally said. "Not just what Brielle said, what I didn't say. I had 10 seconds, Mom, 10 seconds to stand up and say that's not okay, and I let them pass because I was scared of undermining her in front of her whole professional network. I chose her comfort over your dignity, and I didn't even have to think about it. That's the part that scares me most. It wasn't even a hard decision for me. It was just automatic." "I noticed," I said quietly. "I know you did," he said. "I've been trying to figure out when that became automatic. I don't think it happened all at once. I think it was 100 small moments over 2 years, starting probably around the time we bought the house, where I learned that protecting Brielle's public story mattered more than keeping the actual record straight. And somewhere in there, you became the person I let absorb the erasure because you never fought back, and she always did." I let that sit between us for a moment before answering. "You're not wrong," I said, "but I want you to hear something else, too. I let you learn that lesson, Nathan. I taught it to you just as much as you learned it every time I smiled through something that should have made me furious. We built that pattern together. You're not the only one who needs to change how he behaves." He nodded slowly, his eyes wet in the porch light. "I don't know how to fix 2 years of that in one conversation." "You don't," I said. "You fix it the same way you'd fix any other bad habit, slowly and out loud every single time it comes up again." "Why didn't you ever correct Diane, or any of them yourself?" he asked. "You're not exactly a woman who lets things go easily. I've seen you argue a hospital billing error down to the penny. Why let this slide for 2 years?" "Because a billing error is professional," I said. "This felt personal, and personal things are harder to correct in the moment without feeling like you're making a scene at your own son's celebration. I think I convinced myself that patience here was a virtue. It wasn't. It was just delay. Brielle did not call me for almost 3 weeks. I didn't expect her to. She came to my house on a Saturday afternoon in early autumn, nearly a month after the housewarming. She stood on my porch holding a small potted plant, an offering that felt to me both awkward and strangely honest. "Can I come in?" she asked, standing there in the early autumn light. Her voice had none of its usual polish. "You can," I said, and stepped aside, holding the door open a little longer than strictly necessary. We sat in my living room, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally, Brielle set the plant down and looked at her hands. "I've lost the sponsorship deal," she said quietly. "Denise called personally to say word got around about the loan situation, and the brand had to ask whether the renovation's finances had ever actually been what I'd represented them as. I didn't have a good answer." "I've been telling myself for weeks that you overreacted," she continued. "But I keep coming back to the fact that I made that joke standing in a house you made possible, wearing confidence you funded, in front of people whose opinion of me mattered more than yours ever did. That's not really a joke. That's just who I let myself become." "Why did you do it?" I asked. "Not just that night. All of it." She was quiet for a long time. "I think I was scared," she finally said. "I grew up in homes that were never really ours, always temporary. When we finally got the farmhouse, I needed it to be a story about my own capability, not about needing anyone's help. Every time I acknowledged your part in it, it felt like admitting the dream wasn't as impressive as I needed it to be. Gratitude isn't weakness, Brielle, I said. I never once asked you to grovel. I would have settled for being introduced by my actual contribution instead of a joke about my flannel shirt. I told my mom you'd never actually contributed anything, Brielle said quietly. She still thinks that, actually, since I haven't corrected it yet. I keep thinking about that dinner, how sincerely she believed we'd done all of it alone, and how easily I let her keep believing that. You'll correct it when you're ready, I said. There's no version of this where every piece gets fixed at once. She sat quietly for a moment longer, turning the potted plant slightly on the coffee table. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Why did you keep giving all those years if it hurt this much? You could have stopped after the first video, the first time I left you out of the story entirely. Why 2 years? I thought about that honestly before answering, because I kept believing the next milestone would finally be the one where I got acknowledged properly, I said. Because Nathan's happiness actually mattered more to me than my own comfort for a long time. And because if I'm honest, some part of me was afraid that if I stopped giving, I'd lose whatever place I still had in this new family you and Nathan were building, that the money was the only thing keeping me relevant to it. It took that toast in front of 30 people to show me that place had already shrunk to almost nothing long before the money ever mattered. Brielle's eyes filled again. That's the saddest thing I've heard all season, she said quietly. And I'm the reason it's true. You're part of the reason, I said. Nathan is part of it too. I'm part of it for staying quiet as long as I did. Nobody in this gets to be the only villain, Brielle. That would be too easy for everyone involved. She nodded slowly, tears gathering. I don't know how to undo 2 years of that in one conversation. You don't undo it, I told her gently. You just stop doing it starting now and let the next years look different. I don't expect you to forgive me today, she said. I don't think I've earned that yet. No, I agreed, you haven't. But this is a start. She nodded, wiped her eyes, and stood to leave. At the door, she paused. The $8,500 a month equivalent, the higher rate you're calling due. Is there any chance you'd reconsider once we're actually further along? I'll consider adjusting it, I said, once I see real evidence that the story has actually changed, not just in a single video, but consistently over time. Not out of vanity, Brielle, out of basic accuracy. I'm not interested in punishing you or Nathan. I'm interested in finally being an honest part of this family's story. The weeks that followed settled into something neither entirely healed nor entirely broken, the way most real repairs actually begin. Nathan and Brielle refinanced the remaining balance through a conventional bank within the 90-day window at a considerably higher rate than my 2%, a fact Nathan told me had been humbling in ways he hadn't expected. Seeing what the bank actually charges made me understand, for the first time, exactly what you'd been giving us, he said. They also sat down together with an actual financial planner for the first time in their marriage, a careful, soft-spoken man who asked them, in their very first meeting, to describe the biggest financial decision of their relationship so far. Nathan told me later that they both simply sat there for a long moment, because the honest answer was the farmhouse, and neither of them had actually made that decision entirely on their own. They worked through a real household budget over the following months that didn't quietly assume a below-market safety net neither of them had ever properly acknowledged. Brielle's content income now factored in honestly alongside Nathan's teaching salary rather than treated as a supplementary bonus on top of a house they'd never truly budgeted for themselves. That October, Nathan and Brielle invited me to Sunday dinner at the farmhouse for the first time since the party. A small gathering with no cameras, no styled appetizers, just the three of us around the reclaimed wood kitchen island. The house smelled of roasting chicken when I arrived, homemade rather than catered, a welcome change from the carefully arranged appetizer boards I'd grown used to at every gathering there over the previous 2 years. I arrived carrying a casserole, and Brielle met me at the door, drying her hands on a dish towel. I made the whole meal myself tonight, she said, a little self-consciously. No styling, no photos. I wanted it to just be dinner. You didn't have to do that, I said, setting my casserole dish down on the counter beside her own simple, unstyled spread. I wanted to, she said. I think I've spent a long time trying to impress an audience that was never going to be impressed by anything real. I'd rather learn how to actually host the people who matter. She led me into the kitchen, where Nathan was already setting the table, 3 plates instead of the elaborate place settings I remembered from every previous gathering. Simple, Nathan said, catching my eye and smiling. We're trying simple for a while. Dinner that evening had none of the performance I'd grown used to over the previous 2 years. Nobody mentioned the brand's follower count. Nobody described a recent sponsorship opportunity in exhaustive detail. Nathan talked about a history unit he was excited to teach that semester, genuinely animated in a way I hadn't seen from him in months. Brielle asked me genuine questions about my nursing career, questions that had nothing to do with the house at all, wanting to know about the hardest case I'd ever worked, the moment I knew I wanted to specialize in trauma rather than something calmer. I told her about my first year in the emergency room, how terrified I'd been of making a mistake that cost someone their life, and how Walt used to remind me every single morning before my shift that fear and competence could occupy the same body at the same time. Brielle listened to the whole story without once reaching for her phone, and I found myself, for the first time in 2 years, genuinely enjoying her company rather than simply tolerating it. Brielle washed dishes afterward while I dried, the two of us falling into an easy rhythm neither of us had practiced together before. I used to think a beautiful home meant looking like you'd built it entirely yourself, she said quietly, handing me a plate. I think I finally understand that a beautiful home is just one where nobody has to pretend. That's a hard thing to learn, I told her. I'm glad you learned it before it cost you more than it already did. It cost us plenty, she said. But I think we got off relatively easy, honestly, considering what it could have cost. Brielle's content brand shifted noticeably after that. Her next major post about the farmhouse included an honest accounting of the financing, mentioning the family loan directly and thanking me by name for making the renovation possible. A caption that read, in part, "This house exists because my mother-in-law believed in us before we'd proven anything, and I spent too long pretending otherwise." The comments underneath that post looked entirely different from anything she'd received before. Longer, more thoughtful. Several followers writing about their own complicated family financial arrangements they'd never felt comfortable discussing publicly. One comment in particular stayed with me, a woman writing that she'd been quietly resenting her own mother-in-law's financial help for years without ever articulating why, and that Brielle's honesty had helped her finally understand her own situation more clearly. When Nathan sent me the post, I read it 3 times before setting my phone down. A few weeks after that Sunday dinner, a handwritten card arrived in my mailbox, Nathan's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Inside, he'd written only a few lines. "Mom, I keep thinking about the 10 seconds I had at that party and didn't use. I can't get those back, but I can promise you every 10 seconds after that one. Thank you for teaching me, the hard way, what it actually costs to stay quiet and what it's worth to finally speak." Tucked inside the same envelope, on a smaller card of her own, Brielle had written a shorter note. "Meg, I spent 2 years building a story I thought needed to be entirely mine to be worth telling. Thank you for showing me the hard way that the version with you in it is actually the better story." I folded both cards carefully and placed them in the same drawer where I kept a small photograph of Walt standing proudly beside the house we'd bought together decades earlier. I called Josephine Reyes a few weeks after the notice went out to update her on how everything had actually unfolded, since the situation had evolved somewhat differently than either of us originally expected. She listened to the whole story with the same careful attention she brought to every case review, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before saying, "Margaret, I've drafted a lot of demand notices over the years, and I can tell you what you did wasn't reckless. It was actually one of the more disciplined uses of a standard clause I've seen a client execute in a long time." I told her I hadn't thought of it in those terms, that it had felt, in the moment, more like an act of pure emotion than discipline. Sometimes the two aren't as far apart as people assume, she said. You built in a safeguard because you were being careful 2 years ago. The fact that you eventually needed it doesn't make you any less careful for having built it in the first place. Before we hung up, she added one more thing. For what it's worth, Margaret, most of my clients never actually use the safeguards we build into their family agreements. I'm glad yours turned out to matter. It means the whole exercise wasn't just theoretical. I attended the refinancing closing myself at Nathan's invitation, sitting quietly in the corner of the title company's small conference room while he and Brielle signed the new paperwork with the bank's representative. Watching Nathan read every clause carefully this time, asking questions he would never have thought to ask 2 years earlier, I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. Afterward, in the parking lot, Nathan hugged me tightly and said simply, "Thank you for making me actually understand what I was signing, even if it took this to get there." On the exact day the refinance closed, 90 days almost to the hour after I'd sent the original notice, I drove past the farmhouse on my way to the grocery store, not planning to stop, simply curious to see it still standing exactly where it had always stood. Through the front window, I could see Nathan moving around the kitchen and Brielle out on the porch watering a row of potted herbs she'd planted that spring. Both of them looking, even from the street, entirely unremarkable in the best possible way. Simply two people going about an ordinary evening in a house that finally, honestly, belonged to them. I sat in my car for a moment, remembering the water-damaged rooms I'd first walked through with Nathan 2 years earlier, before continuing on to the grocery store, satisfied that whatever had broken between us that August evening was already, slowly, being repaired from the inside out. 3 months after the housewarming, once the story had genuinely changed and Nathan and Brielle had rebuilt their financial footing around the honest number, I quietly forgave the remaining interest on what was left of the original note, now properly refinanced elsewhere, a final gesture that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with what had finally been said honestly. Nathan and Brielle hosted the whole family for Christmas that year, the first time in years that both of my children had gathered under one roof at once. The farmhouse filled with the smell of a turkey roasting and the sound of Kate's kids arguing cheerfully over a board game in the living room. Kate's own kids, thrilled to finally see the farmhouse they'd only ever heard about in phone calls, spent the afternoon running between rooms while the adults gathered in the kitchen, Brielle patiently answering their questions about which walls used to be different colors before the renovation. Over dinner, Kate's husband asked, innocently enough, how the whole loan situation had eventually resolved itself, clearly having heard only fragments of the story secondhand. The table went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that used to precede something painful in this family, before Brielle simply said, "Meg financed our entire house, and I made a cruel joke about it in front of 30 people. She called the loan due to make sure everyone understood exactly what she'd done for us. It was the best possible outcome, honestly, even though it didn't feel that way for about 6 weeks. Nobody laughed uncomfortably. Nobody needed the subject changed. Kate's younger daughter, 9 and endlessly literal in the way 9-year-olds often are, looked up from her plate and asked, "Wait, so Grandma basically bought the whole house and Aunt Brielle made fun of her for it?" When her mother confirmed that yes, that was essentially what had happened, she shook her head slowly and said, "That's kind of mean. No offense, Aunt Brielle." Brielle laughed, more freely than I'd heard her laugh in months. "None taken," she said. "You're right, it was kind of mean." I laughed harder at that exchange than I had in weeks, struck, not for the first time, by how effortlessly children manage to name the plain truth adults spend years carefully avoiding, and grateful, in that particular moment, for a 9-year-old's complete lack of interest in softening anything for anyone's comfort. Brielle called her own mother that same week, finally correcting the story Diane had believed for 2 years. Brielle told me about the call afterward, her voice still a little shaken. She cried, Brielle said, not because she was upset with me, but because she said she wished she'd known, so she could have thanked you properly at that dinner instead of going on and on about how impressive we were on our own. Diane sent me a card shortly after that call, simple and heartfelt, thanking me for something she said she wished she'd understood 2 years sooner, and mentioning almost shyly that she hoped we might get the chance to know each other properly someday, without 2 years of misunderstanding standing between us. I keep that card in the same drawer as the others now, a small, unexpected addition to a collection I never intended to start. Kate visited that spring, and we spent an afternoon walking through my own garden together, the same one Walt had planted decades earlier. "You seem lighter," she said at one point. "I don't know how else to describe it. Lighter than you've seemed in years, actually, maybe since before Dad died." I think I finally stopped carrying something I should have set down a long time ago, something considerably heavier than I ever let myself admit at the time, I told her. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd said something the very first time at that first video Brielle posted?" "All the time," I admitted. "I don't think it would have gone well, honestly. I don't think I had the clarity yet to say it the right way. Sometimes you need years of smaller moments before you finally understand exactly what you're actually asking for." "And what were you asking for in the end?" I thought about that for a moment, watching a bee move between the peonies Walt had planted the summer before he died. "Just to be seen accurately," I said, "not celebrated, not thanked excessively. Just described honestly, the way anyone would want to be described in their own family's story." I think about that housewarming often. The joke about my flannel, the silence that followed my own toast, the walk to my car alone under the porch lights I'd helped pay to install. At the moment, it felt like the end of something, the end of a relationship with my daughter-in-law that I had tried, for over 2 years, to quietly nurture with generosity nobody acknowledged. Looking back now, I understand it was actually the beginning of something else entirely. A family finally built on honesty rather than a story convenient enough to photograph. I don't regret a single dollar I gave toward that house. Nathan's happiness mattered to me, and it still does. What I regret is how long I let myself believe that funding someone's dream was the same thing as earning acknowledgement of it. Those two things can look identical from the outside, and it takes real courage to separate them, especially when the person benefiting from the confusion has built an entire public identity around the confusion continuing. I think about the specific moments now with a clarity I didn't have while I was living inside them. The word encouraging at Nathan's birthday dinner, the phrase small home equity arrangement on live television, the description of my contribution as knowing where to cut corners smartly, delivered in front of a room full of people whose approval mattered more to Brielle than my own ever seemed to. The quiet exclusion from a magazine spread's family and friends section, framed as simply a matter of visual composition. Each one seemed small enough to excuse in isolation. Strung together, they formed something considerably less innocent, a pattern deliberate enough that I no longer believed, looking back, that any of it was entirely accidental. Brielle may not have consciously planned each individual omission, but the cumulative effect served a purpose she understood on some level, even if she never named it to herself, keeping the person who made her dream home possible small enough that acknowledging her wouldn't threaten the story Brielle needed to tell about her own capability. Real generosity doesn't require secrecy to survive, and it certainly doesn't require humiliation as its price of admission. If a family needs you to disappear quietly into the background of your own sacrifice in order to feel comfortable with their own story, that discomfort is telling you something important, and it deserves to be listened to, not smoothed over with another quiet transfer. I think of it now the way I used to think about a patient's chart that quietly didn't add up. You can ignore a discrepancy for a long time if you want to. It never once corrects itself on its own. It only continues quietly until someone finally reads the whole chart clearly. I saw Rosalind again that spring, over coffee at the same diner where we'd talked through everything the week after the housewarming, the same booth we'd claimed as ours for years without ever quite deciding to. I told her about the reconciliation dinner, the Christmas gathering, the honest magazine post Brielle had finally shared with her following. Rosalind listened with the same quiet satisfaction she'd shown from the very beginning. "I told you it would matter, holding that line," she said. "Most people don't have the nerve to actually do it, even when they know they should. You did, and look what it actually bought you. Not just the money back, the truth back." I thought about that phrase for days afterward, the truth back, understanding that it described exactly what I'd been missing more than any dollar amount ever could have. Kate asked me once, not long after everything had settled, whether I was angry that it took a public humiliation to finally push me toward a decision I probably should have made a year earlier, quietly, without an audience of 30 guests watching. I told her the truth. I was angry for a while. Not at Brielle, not really, not by the end of it. I was angry at myself for how long I let a category error go uncorrected, mistaking my own silence for generosity, and my own generosity for the whole of my worth in that family. There is a version of giving that is genuinely selfless, and there is a version that is simply self-erasure wearing generosity's clothing. I had been living inside the second version for 2 years, and I hadn't noticed the difference until I was standing in a beautifully lit farmhouse being told gently, cheerfully over a champagne toast exactly how little my contribution was worth compared to how the story sounded without me in it. Nathan and I talk most weeks now, and there is an ease between us that hadn't existed since he was a boy. Before Brielle, before the farmhouse, before 5 years of him learning to go quiet whenever the truth might cost him something with the woman he loved. I don't think that ease came back because of the money. I think it came back because for the first time in a long while he watched his mother choose herself, plainly, without apology, and something in him finally understood that this was allowed. Sons learn what they're permitted to become, partly by watching what their mothers are willing to accept. I had, without meaning to, spent 2 years teaching my son that his mother could be quietly erased from her own generosity indefinitely so long as the note stayed current. Calling it due taught him something entirely different, and it arrived, I think, at exactly the moment he needed to learn it. Rosalind asked me once, not long after everything had settled, whether I regretted structuring the loan so carefully in the first place. Whether a simple handshake and a gift might have spared everyone the eventual complication of a formal demand notice. I told her the truth. I was more grateful for that careful structure than for almost anything else I'd done in the entire arrangement. Without it, I would have had no real recourse beyond hurt feelings and quiet resentment, the same trap so many families fall into when generosity goes unacknowledged. The paperwork didn't cause the conflict. It simply gave the conflict, once it finally arrived, somewhere real to land. The same way a good chart gives an emergency room team somewhere real to look when a patient's story stops adding up on its own. I still help the people I love generously whenever I'm able. I've simply stopped helping people who need me invisible in order to feel like their success belongs entirely to them. There's a difference, and it took a joke about a flannel shirt, delivered in a house I had quietly financed, to finally teach me exactly where that line belongs. These days, when I visit that farmhouse, I don't wonder whether my contribution will be acknowledged the way it deserves to be. I've learned that the people worth supporting will always find a way to say thank you clearly, out loud, in front of everyone who needs to hear it, and the ones who won't were never actually grateful for the help in the first place, only for the comfort it quietly provided them while they told a more impressive story to everyone else. Walt used to say that a good measurement only means something if you're willing to double-check it against reality. It took me 2 years, one housewarming, and a single formal notice to finally insist that mine be checked the same way. I don't intend to round myself down again. I am 65 years old, a widow, a retired trauma nurse, a mother who still helps the people she loves whenever she's able. But I am no longer a woman who finances a home quietly while being mocked for the very clothes she wears into it. That particular version of me stayed behind in that beautifully lit farmhouse, along with an untouched glass of Prosecco and a joke about flannel that nobody at that party will ever quite forget. I drove home that night as one woman, and I woke up the next morning as another, and I have never once wished myself back into the first one. I think sometimes about all those years in the emergency room teaching younger nurses that every good handoff depends on saying out loud exactly what's actually happening with a patient, that you cannot simply hand someone off with a reassuring smile while quietly omitting the details that matter most. It took me 65 years and one very public toast of my own to apply that same standard to my own life. I gave freely for 2 years, and I would give freely again, but I no longer accept a version of gratitude that erases its own evidence. If I am the reason a house was purchased, a dream became possible, a family finally has somewhere permanent to call their own, I intend to remain visible in that story, not because I need applause, but because pretending otherwise was never generosity. It was only ever a kindness to someone else's comfort purchased at the cost of my own. These days, when Nathan calls to tell me about a new project around the farmhouse, a garden bed he's building, or a fence he's finally getting around to repairing, he tells me plainly, without prompting, exactly what it costs and exactly what he needs. No vague requests dressed up as casual mentions. I've come to treasure that plainness more than I ever expected to. It's a small thing, perhaps, compared to the $200,000 that started this whole story. But it's the thing I actually wanted all along, long before I understood that I wanted it. Not gratitude performed for an audience, just honesty offered quietly between two people who trust each other enough not to need an audience at all.